Much, Teredar. Karakoto. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real privilege to speak to everyone today, and I want to emphasize that I'm speaking really on behalf of a group. I'm not quite chair of the biodiversity strategy. I'm chair of the implementation planning group. In other words, how the biodiversity strategy is realized, and I can tell you that I take no responsibility for the strategy. It had been completed just as I arrived about 20 months ago, and it was then that Campbell landed on me and asked if I'd be part of the implementation planning group. And I didn't know. I thought, gee, that sounds like it's a bit ironic that the person who's the newest resident of this area chairs it, but I got to do that, and it's one of the best things that's happened to me since I got here. It was a real learning experience, and in particular getting to work with a really good group of people. I'll introduce you to a few of those, but I do want to note that it is a group process that I'm talking about today. I also want to acknowledge particularly two people in the planning group, and that's Desiree Cull and Keiko Hashiba from the Regional Council, and I think everybody in the group would agree that if it had not been for Desiree and Keiko, we probably wouldn't have made the progress we did as quickly as we did and gotten such a really positive and collegial outcome. So thanks to both of you, and thanks also to the Regional Council, because their capacity to work on this as part of that group reflects the support of the Regional Council, who want to be supportive partners but want this really to be a community-based document, and that's part of the message that I'll talk about today. So briefly, today I'll talk really in three parts. The first is what's the problem, or as it was called previously by Ruud, this is the risk slashing part of this talk. And if you spend your life in conservation, you have risks that are pretty damaged, really, because it's easy to do that day after day, but we progress anyway. I then want to talk about what the community here in Hawke's Bay is proposing to do to address that problem. And lastly, then talk about what the challenges are, what the next steps are, and how we might get there. So let's start with the problem. This probably is a figure that you'll be familiar with. This map is a map of the vegetation types that occurred in the bay prior to human arrival. So 800 to 1,000 years ago, multiple vegetation types, each one represented by a different color. And of course, they hadn't been altered. No one was here to do that. Some hundreds of years later, that's come up. Hundreds of years later, it's quite a different picture. About at least 70% of the original vegetation, the pre-human vegetation, has disappeared. It's been changed. The areas represented in white are the areas that are modified habitat. You'll see that most of those are in the eastern part of Hawke's Bay. That's the area that's most suitable for agriculture and in all its various forms. And the parts that have not changed as much are in the least accessible and most difficult geographically. And the other thing you'll see is that in that white part in the east, that the remaining indigenous habitat is quite dispersed, quite fragmented, tiny little patches throughout the region. And of course, that part of Hawke's Bay is the part that's most in private ownership. So dealing with the remaining fragments of vegetation types and habitats in the eastern Hawke's Bay will involve necessarily working closely with landowners, and there's lots of those. So one of the consequences of changing habitats, of course, is that you lose species when that happens. Some of these are well known. These are some of the ones that are lost in this region, and these are the iconic ones, the vertebrates, the large species. And of course, many of those are gone throughout almost all of New Zealand anyway, but there's certainly, what's here now is only a small representation of what was once here. There is a serious problem, and there are consequences for humans. We've talked today repeatedly about ecosystem services, and those come in many forms, but basically ecosystem services is a very human-oriented term. Nature doesn't care about services. Those are services that nature provides free for us, for our benefit as people. And if we destroy the indigenous species, the biodiversity, then we begin destroying the foundation for our life. Get your razor blades ready now. I could go on for the next hour, but I won't. I just want you to be aware that there are consequences for us. So the loss of biodiversity results ultimately in a loss of ecosystem services. Those young people are using that tree to rest on. I wish that the services that are lost when that tree goes were as small as that, but of course the services represent a whole range of things that Ruud mentioned this morning. In this region, perhaps the most obvious problem, and certainly a persistent one, is the state of water up here. I've been here about 20 months, and there has hardly been a week, possibly not much of a day, has gone by where there hasn't been something to do with water issues in one form or another in the local papers and on the news, and sometimes the national news, and sometimes the international news, in fact. And it's hardly a coincidence that that screaming and yelling you've heard next door is because there's a hearing going on today about another proposed water conservation order. And it was headlines in today's paper, or yesterday's paper as well. So water is a critical issue here, and it's not just urban versus rural. Sometimes it's one rural user against another. There's no a single pattern that it takes. That problem, of course, as has been said, is critical. Biodiversity, ecosystem services are the foundation, as I've said, as many others have said, of our wealth and well-being. So it's not just that we like having plants and animals around, it's that we actually need them. If we destroy them, we pay a price. So, that price can be expressed in lots of terms, but certainly in terms of money. The wealth in this region arises from agriculture, it certainly arises from tourism, and there are certainly, as Paul Atkins said, health consequences to the people here if we don't take care of it. So that realization has led to community activity for some time. It's not like there hasn't been a conservation community here. There are and have for some time been efforts to return species, missing species to this region, and there have been replanting efforts going on, and lots of pest mammal trapping, and those have been variably successful. The problem in part is that they, of course, have been fragmented around the region, and they've been fragmented, they've been uncoordinated, often in isolated places. And so about 8 years ago, environmental groups and others began to get together to talk about what might be done in a more coordinated way. The first expression of that was the land and water strategy that was developed in about, I think, 2011, that says. That was followed by realization that a general biodiversity strategy was needed for this region. Groups came together to make that happen, and in 2016, January of 2016, a strategy for the whole region was launched. And I'll tell you a little bit about that before we go on to the next bit. This strategy is characterized as a total community document. In a sense, there wasn't an owner. In a sense, there were groups that supported it, but multiple groups, and you see the document there on the right, but it's a community-based document intended to reflect the interests of the whole community. It's one of those that I would call a hearts and minds document. It's not intended to be prescriptive in the sense other than in saying, here are some outcomes we want, here are the values we're working with, but we want people with us because their hearts and minds are with us, not because it's necessarily a legal requirement, even though there certainly are laws already involved in that. It's also a document that's pretty aspirational. It aims high, and which is a wonderful thing. And it's based on creating a shared vision and shared goals for the whole region. And the good news is that this group of organizations whose logos you see there all bought into it. So it's a large number of NGOs, all 5 councils, the regional council and 4 district or city councils in the area signed up to it, iwi, and so on. So it's Federated Farmers is in there. So all sorts of groups are accepted this as the right idea. The question came to be, how do we move forward on that? In the strategy, it's really in 2 bits. So in the middle circle there, you see that aspiration, working together for better biodiversity. What's important about that is it's got 2 parts. One is the working together. The first bit is about humans. This will only happen if people work together, if the various groups and individuals all come together to achieve the vision. The other, and that reflected in the various 3 of the primary strategic goals in yellow there, are ones that reflect the various targets, the strategic goals that directly address the human components of achieving this. So 3 are for humans, 2 have to do with plants and animals. One is more species, and the other is more native species, and the other is more native habitats. That's what plant and animal life is back. So that's pretty simple. The tricky part has been acknowledged repeatedly today, is people. The next step was to begin to identify supporters, and people were invited to join this process and to do so as a partner. There are 3 levels of partnership. Accountable partners are those partners that have either some legal or financial or other responsibility to actually do things that help to achieve the goals. The regional council, the district councils and so on are in that category, Fish and Game and so on. There are supporting partners that commit at a lower level to working towards it, and then Friends of the Accord. And the Friends of the Accord are a level of support that anyone can engage in. It's basically a hearts and minds thing. It's moral support that says, we're with you, and that's where most of us as private citizens have signed on. Now, this august and handsome group of people is the implementation planning group that I got to join. This is probably about 3/4 of the people that were in it. You don't see anything in the way of uniforms there, but the majority of people there participated because they're representing one of those organizations that signed the accord or signed the strategy. So they're there to represent the broad array of formal organizations with an interest in this around the group. But there were also people like me who I thought I was going to retire up here, but they're private citizens and in their private capacity participated in this as well. And for me, it was interesting at the start because I hardly knew anyone. I did know 1 or 2 people, but not well, and certainly not in this capacity. And so for about 18 months, we met and we met again, and we met with community groups, and it was great because people had the opportunity to express any concerns they had. Sometimes they were expressed quite vehemently, but that was good. It led us to understand each other, to see where people came from, and begin to understand the views that might have conflicted with some that we had. So it was a great group. And the outcome of that was the document on the right there. So on the left is the biodiversity strategy. On the right is the action plan that's it's on the presses right now. It will be available for general circulation almost any day. But that work is done now, and we're moving into the formal, we have a plan. We're moving to the implementation stage. I want to tell you about that really is the main bit of this talk. But the key thing is, one of the key things we wanted to do was to link into other initiatives. We're not going on our own here. This is about bringing people together. The plan itself mirrors the National Biodiversity Action Plan, both in structure and in the time frame involved. And as you might have gathered from what I've said earlier, the majority of the immediate tasks, we identified 6 immediate tasks to get going. 5 of those 6 are directly focused on people. The first one, simply prioritizing sites for restoration, amounts to an inventory. So going around the region, identifying those sites that might have something to offer in terms of starting points for restoration that may be at risk for disappearing if action isn't taken. and identifying those and then prioritizing them using various schemes. But even that, of course, involves human values. So really, those are all people-focused. There are three very concrete outcomes immediately, and that are the three new bodies identified in the bolded blue there in the middle: the Biodiversity Guardians of Hawke's Bay, the Biodiversity Foundation, and the Biodiversity Forum. And I want to tell you quickly about those. The Biodiversity Guardians are a group that anyone can belong to. This is the group that effectively owns the strategy. So it's a citizens-based, a community-based group, not a regional council, not a government body, not an NGO, not Forest and Bird. It's a group that came together as an incorporated society that will be effectively the overseer, the governance group for developing the implementing the present plan and developing future implementation plans as the work progresses. They're first of all keeping an eye on the vision itself. The strategy should stay in place for the next 3 decades, but how the work is done, of course, will not. That will change. They have a critical role with the foundation. They appoint 2 of the foundation trustees. Additionally, they will advise the foundation about how they might spend their money. And lastly, they will manage the Biodiversity Forum. And the Biodiversity Forum is intended to be the public face of much of biodiversity and conservation-related activity in the Bay. It will attempt to bring together all the environmental action groups around the place, from small to large. It will be a way for people to come together to do that joining up that so many people have talked about today and that is absolutely critical. And it will have all sorts of activities associated with it, but it will be a critical public engagement vehicle for this project. The foundation has as one of its primary responsibilities just what you'd expect: money. Money doesn't do everything, but it sure does a lot, and it makes things happen. And the intention for the foundation is to do things that go well beyond any of the formal legal and other responsibilities that management agencies have. So it's not there to raise money to allow the regional council or the district councils or Fish and Game or whatever to continue doing what they've been doing. It's to raise money that allows new things to be done, to take step changes in the way in which biodiversity is managed in the region, to create new opportunities for groups to be engaged in various ways. The first goal is an endowment, and that's thinking big. That's talking tens of millions over the next 3 decades, and millions even in the short term. The second aspect of that is to create a community conservation fund. In other words, it's not very inspiring to people to contribute money towards an endowment if they don't get to do something right now. And there's a whole community out there wanting to do stuff very quickly. So we will aim to create a conservation fund, small funding, but nonetheless, that's what many groups need, and that will begin the process and also be part of the public engagement tools for this program. And lastly, what we're calling a biodiversity bank, and that's simply a sort of like a bank account where funds that allow groups to collaborate can be lodged and do projects that really involve multiple groups. Hardly anybody has an operating budget that works to an ecological project time frame. This allows that to be managed around. I want to tell you about the trustees of the foundation because people matter on this. There is a set of about 6 establishment trustees in place right now. They were largely people on the implementation planning group, not entirely, and their job is simply to get the foundation up and running, to implement protocols, to get advertising done and things like that. And from next July 1st, there will be a new set of trustees in place according to a different model. The Guardians, the chair of the Guardians will be a member, and the Guardians will nominate a second one. The chief executive, excuse me, the chief executive of the regional council or their nominee will be part of it to ensure that, help ensure that good partnership. And then up to 5 more people, is it 5, is that right? Up to 6 more people, I think, a total of 9 trustees maximum, to ensure that various interests are represented. So not there to represent an organization, they're to represent expertise in, excuse me, in essential fields. For example, the local authorities, iwi, landowners, and some relevant science. And those can take various forms. Some people will be able to represent multiple of those interests, but the intention is, again, to get a community-based group representing the interests of the people of the region, but with relevant knowledge. Can we succeed? Well, who knows? We're at the beginning. It's a 30-year project. That's the challenge for us, and 30 years may be a long time, but for something it's taken us hundreds of years to bring nature to the situation it is right now. It won't be fixed immediately, but I think 30 years is a realistic time frame to make a good start on the problem. It's very like we have a starter kit. You know, we have some tools now. We've got a place to begin, and perhaps this is the end of the beginning, I don't really know. But at least the problem has been well acknowledged. I think today we've heard that from almost every speaker. I think Bruce Wills brings a particularly useful perspective. One of the concerns of the implementation group was that that there is a too big an urban-rural divide to bridge. I don't think that's true. We simply have to work to get across it. And I have no doubt that what Bruce said, that changes are coming in agriculture, is exactly right and about time. We have other bits of the tool. We have a strategy. We had that for about 1.5 years. We have a plan now. We have a governance infrastructure. So we've got a sort of oversight group to get things going, to try to bring together people and groups to make to realize the money we need. We have a pretty committed leadership for these. The implementation planning group has stepped up in the initial stage to establish the Guardians and the Foundation. There are certainly people all around the region who are doing things that we can count on. We do have, I think, a supportive regional community, and that began with the regional council who offered us the support we needed to get this group through. We do have some immediate challenges that would be pretty obvious. Nobody will do this on their own. The first task is to secure these partnerships that we believe that are out there, to begin talking with the signers of the Accord and saying, okay, what's next? How do we involve you in bigger and better ways? And we've already had indications from some of those that they're interested in that. Coordinating the agency work will be a task for a committee, and that'll be a big job and an ongoing job, and probably a fairly challenging one. There are some significant initiatives, as you've heard here. Cape Sanctuary is certainly one that's well underway now. Cape to City is making great progress. Those are big, those are landscape scale, but small landscape scale when you think of it in terms of the whole region. But they're places we need to start. We need that national engagement with agencies like DOC and MFE, but also with the initiatives like Predator Free 2050. And most significantly, we've got to grow the conservation community here in the Bay, and that means businesses, it means iwi, it means landholders and the farming community. There's no reason to be pessimistic about that. I think there's a growing understanding that we all have common interests. And finally, we have to get that foundation going. I think initially that will involve finding the right people to be trustees, to do the job, to be the public face, to raise that money. There is that small matter of $50 million. Frankly, I'm less worried about $50 million than I am about getting the plan right. And I think that if we can get a plan in place that wins the hearts and minds of people, gets people engaged, then the $50 million will be not too difficult a task compared to that. So can we do it for 30 years? Well, we're at that crossroads right now. As speakers have pointed out, nature's only continuing to go to hell pretty rapidly. So it's time to see whether we can reverse that trend, take the steps needed to lay a foundation for continuing to get back to where we want to be. The foundation is established now. The Guardians will be established by the end of the year. A project manager will be appointed shortly. So those steps are being taken. The Regional Council has been very supportive. They've agreed for funding in the coming year, and believe me, we'll be talking to other groups. So watch this space. Come back in 10 years and we'll give you a progress report. Come back in 3 years, I hope, and we'll give you a very positive one. Let's just remember that vision is the one we want to share and keep in the front of our minds. Thank you very much.